Hello. Today is the day after Easter in the very strange spring of 2020. Where I live, it's a cold day and a windy, gusty day with the rain blowing in from Lake Ontario. A good day, perhaps, for a story. Some years ago, I wrote a story called, well, lots of different things. Call it perhaps quite simply, The Inn. And I used it originally as a sermon, but it's grown far too long to be used even with the most patient of congregations. But I thought I'd take the chance today to read it to you in two parts. Here it is. The wind was blowing from the east that day, from the cold desert hills across the Jordan. It was bitter, the east wind, and young Simon had been firmly instructed by his uncle to be sure that the door to the inn stayed closed. The house was full, and there was no point in troubling a house full of paying guests simply to lure in those who could not be accommodated anyway. Simon's uncle, the innkeeper, was in his accustomed position behind the bar, doling out the red Syrian wine to the company. Simon's mother, newly widowed, nursed Simon's small brother as she prepared the stew for the evening meal. It was good living in an inn, especially when the travelers told their long tales of distant lands and wonders unknown to tiny Judean villages. Simon almost missed the first tap on the door, but the second, a more vigorous rap, shook him from his comfortable post. He opened the door a trifle and slipped out into the dust-laden wind. The man was a little below the medium size, except in the arms, which were long and strongly built. The hands were massive with heavy calluses, and only 4 fingers on the left hand. Carpenter, or perhaps sailor, thought Simon. Simon looked up at the stranger's eyes, which were shot with red from the dust, and perhaps from something else. "We need a place to stay," he said. "The whole town's full," replied Simon. "It's the census, you know." "I know about the census," answered the stranger, "but they said you might have room. My wife, He nodded towards the left. For the first time, Simon caught sight of another figure huddled against the wall for shelter from the biting wind. She was young, younger than the man himself, realized Simon. In fact, she was not that many years beyond Simon himself. Her belly was stretched like a newly filled wineskin. She raised her head for an instant, and Simon was caught by her eyes. There was something about the eyes that made Simon unwilling to add to their troubles. Simon looked back towards the man, husband rather. "Tie your beast to the post and follow me," instructed Simon, as he slipped through the door into the main room of the old inn. Every eye turned towards the three as they entered. Even the squint-eyed stranger who had so carefully avoided looking directly at anybody all day. "Uncle, these people need a place to stay," announced Simon. Uncle wiped his hands on the wine-stained cloth at his waist, his brow furrowed with trouble. "I truly am sorry," he said, "but the house is full to overflowing. Perhaps you can try one of the homes in the village. They're taking in visitors these days. The census, you know." "We tried there first," said the traveler. "My wife, she needs privacy just now." All eyes turned to the girl, who bowed her head with shame and embarrassment. "I see I would like to help, but..." Just then Simon's mother swayed through the door from the kitchen, child on hip. "Surely we can squeeze them in somewhere," she reasoned. "There's a little floor space in the room with..." She glanced slightly in the direction of the squint-eyed stranger. No, perhaps not there, she sighed. I tell you the truth, sir, said Uncle. There's not a cubit's worth of space in the house. Why, there's hardly even space in the stable, let alone... Is the stable dry and out of the wind? Asked the newcomer. You seem powerfully eager to find a place in this village, observed Squint Eye, abandoning any attempt to remain inconspicuous. The government won't worry too much about missing you, unless you belong to certain families, that is. What's your name, stranger? Joseph, replied the newcomer. Joseph Ben David, continued Squint Eye. Joseph Ben Jacob, came the reply, with a slightly defiant tone to the voice. I warrant you're not too happy with the government making you travel at this time of year, and with her in that condition. I say nothing against the government, stated Joseph flatly, neither against the Romans nor King Herod. Simon was surprised that his uncle was allowing the questioning to go on so long, but no one else appeared to share his surprise. The other guests were determinedly studying the quality and clarity of the Syrian wine. Just then the pregnant girl swayed dizzily. You poor thing, exclaimed Simon's mother as she caught the girl's elbow. The stable, said Joseph. It'll have to do for now. Certainly, replied Uncle hurriedly. Simon, boy, help the lady and her husband. Simon ran ahead into the dim light of the stable. Swiftly he shifted several of the tired beasts closer together to make space in the corner stall, farthest from the east wind. From the byre he brought fresh hay to scatter on the packed earth of the floor. In truth, the stable was not such a bad place after all. Certainly the animals did not reek so strongly as some of the paying guests. Their gentle nickering was softer on the ears than the braying laughter of the drinkers in the bar. And not nearly so many fleas, thought Simon. He piled more straw close to the wall. This will make not so very bad a bed, sir, ma'am, said Simon. The girl smiled. Perhaps it was the first time in her life that anyone had called her ma'am. It will do very well, but do not call me ma'am. Simon, is it? My name is Mary, replied the girl. The shed was growing gloomy in the gathering dusk. Simon looked about. I'll bring an oil lamp, he said. But I think my mother would say, mind the straw. So she would, boy, said Joseph, as he set his wife next to the wall. Simon slipped back to the inn. His mother was stirring the stew, sniffing with complacency the steam rising from the pot. Take some of this stew to that poor dear and her man, she said to Simon, and some bread and a small skin of the wine. She needs it by the look of her. When Simon returned to the stable, burdened with lamp, flask, and clay pot of stew, he noticed that Joseph was gently stroking Mary's hand. Silently he laid the provisions behind Joseph and hung the lamp from a protruding nail. May the God of Israel bless you for your mercy on the strangers who come to your door, spoke Joseph. Mary simply opened her eyes and looked her thanks. Oh, it's little enough, replied Simon, abashed. There's nothing little about hospitality, said Joseph. Simon nodded his amen and went out into the gloom, firmly closing the stable door behind him. The night was long and busy in the inn. Simon could see the smile tugging at the corner of his uncle's mouth as the wine poured out and the coins rolled in. No one spared a thought for the animals in the stable, let alone for the humans there. At last the inn grew silent, and Simon lay quietly beside his mother and small brother. He slept deeply, waking but once, hearing a slight scuffling in the street and sniffing the unmistakable odor of hill-raised sheep. Those dirty shepherds, muttered his mother. What are they doing here at this time of year? And all the bars are closed too. But she tumbled back into sleep, and they heard no more until the rooster crowed its welcome to the sun. It was Simon's daily task to muck out the beasts in the stable. He entered the stable lit by the slanting rays of the morning sun. Joseph stirred and came forward to greet Simon. Perhaps you could ask your mother to step out if she is able, young man, said Joseph. My mother? She never works the stable, sir, replied Simon. Joseph beckoned Simon forward with a shrug of the shoulder and a slight motion of the four-fingered hand. Simon stumbled forward 3 steps, looking around Joseph, and saw, laid in the manger, wrapped tightly in old but clean cloths, a sleeping baby. Mary, whose face seemed as white as the fleece of the sheep on the hills, looked up at Simon. She seemed content. What is his name? Asked Simon. Mary did not answer, but looked a question at Joseph. I think we had better call him Jesus, answered Joseph. He muttered something under his breath. Simon was not quite sure that he had heard correctly. It sounded like something about people and sins. An odd thing to say about a baby, he thought. I'll fetch my mother straightway, sir, said Simon, and ran to do so. Some guests registered for the census early that day and left the dusty village. Uncle managed to find a room for the family in the inn. A little late, but better than never, he exclaimed. That evening, Joseph joined the company in the public room. After surveying the crowded bar, he said, This seems a prosperous place, good host. Any work in this neighborhood for a master carpenter? Don't want to go back to Galilee, eh? Interjected Squint Eye, who seemed to overhear every conversation in the room. Don't look so surprised. Your accent gives you away. Lots of political trouble up there. In hot water with the authorities up north? Not at all, sir, I assure you, replied Joseph with surprising calm. Old man, young wife, the neighbors are talking and all that, leered Squint Eye. Something like that, said Joseph, and turned away. Uncle had been fingering his chin thoughtfully. That wind yesterday damaged the roof. Let's see how you do with that job and then we'll decide, he said. All this census business has been good for our pockets. Perhaps there'll be some building around here. Very likely we'll need a room or two more in this very inn. By the next day, the registration for the census was completed. The out-of-town guests all departed. Even Squint Eye left, though not without a lingering stare at Joseph. When he was well out of earshot, Uncle whispered out of the side of his mouth to Joseph, Idumean accent, Herod's country. Government spy? Joseph nodded. I think so. I imagine he's afraid of people like me, descendants of King David. But all I want is to be left in peace and to get to work on your roof. Joseph proved to be a master carpenter indeed. The visitors for the census had left many good coins in the pockets of the villagers, and he found regular work in the village and in the surrounding countryside. Joseph, Mary, and the baby moved into a small clay brick house roofed with the newly popular Greek tiles. When he had a moment to spare, Simon would run over to the house to greet Mary and to play with the tiny Jesus. Simon loved to pick up the tiny wooden toys made by Joseph and hold them before the eyes of the delighted baby. Jesus would always smile at Simon. He had such beautiful eyes, thought Simon, so very much his mother's eyes. That was the year that the 2 brightest wandering stars came together to make what almost seemed one bright star in the east. Simon loved the stars. An old friend of his uncle's, Reuben, a sailor on the great sea of the west, had instructed him in the ways of the night sky. The sailor had taught him how sailors navigate by the North Star, how most stars are fixed in their places, but how 5 wander through the sky, now stopping and moving backwards, now plunging ahead in their paths. The Greeks, Simon knew, called them the wanderers. What do these movements mean? Simon had asked. I do not know, replied Reuben. Only the learned and wise understand such things. It was about this time that strangers from the east came to the village, and following them, once again, Squint Eye. The strangers stayed in the inn, of course. The chief of the strangers spoke to his friends. This does seem to be the place. Both the motion of the stars and what we have heard in the city tell us that. He looked about with an air of slight surprise and addressed Uncle. So, this place is the ancestral home of the great king? That it is, sir, and right proud of it we are. And the people here are his descendants? Oh, bless you, no, sir. Though the Holy One, blessed be he, knows that the great king left enough of them. Why, when the census required them to register here, there wasn't a room to be had in the entire village. But you say that they have left now? All of them? Well, Uncle said in a low voice, for Squint Eye was not far distant. There is Joseph and his wife and new baby. They stayed on here. But don't get him into trouble, sir. He's a good fellow and a fine worker. I have no intention of getting him into trouble, and still less his child. A son, you said? I didn't say, sir, but since you mentioned it, a son it was. But be careful, sir. These things should not be spoken of lightly. We've only had the warmest of welcomes and the most eager assistance since coming to your country. Why this caution? I can tell you are a learned man, sir. Surely you have learned that though the world of nature is plain and trustworthy, it is not so with the world of humans. Here Uncle dropped his voice further. Or of kings. The stranger asked no more, but quietly sipped his wine. Later that evening he took Simon by the arm and asked, Boy, can you direct me to the dwelling of this Joseph of whom your uncle has spoken? I can, sir. Indeed, I can take you there in less time than it would take to give you the directions. The strangers followed Simon through the winding streets. When they reached Joseph's tiny house, they paused before the door. The youngest of the strangers was carrying a small but richly carved chest. Here? He asked in surprise. The chief looked to the sky, nodded gently, and said, The ways of the Mighty One are strange indeed. But have we not been guided? Boy, we thank you for your part in the guiding. You may go to your home now. Simon knew that this last word was not permission, but command. He returned to the inn. The next morning, Joseph came to visit Uncle. It was so early that the guests were yet asleep, even Squint Eye. Joseph's brow was furrowed and his voice anxious. I thank you for your kindness to me and to my family, but I must leave this place. I fear I must ask you for the last of my wages. Oh, certainly, Joseph, I would not for a minute hold back your wages, but why this sudden decision? I cannot truly say, but I know there is great trouble coming. I do not know how or why, but great sorrow is drawing near. I urge you to get away with those whom you love. Well, Joseph, to my mind one place is very much like another in this troubled world, and times have never been so good in Bethlehem. I think we'll stay, but where will you go? Back to Galilee? No, replied Joseph, not there. Perhaps we shall travel on to Egypt. There are many of our people in the great city of Alexandria. I can find work for my hands and safety for my family there, but But please, tell no one of our plans. We leave immediately." Simon held the infant while Mary and Joseph packed their few belongings. Before the sun was halfway to the zenith, all was ready. "I will never forget you," said Simon to the baby. But the infant, as is the way with the very young, said nothing, but only looked at Simon with his fine eyes. "Simon," said Joseph, "check that no one is about, particularly the gentleman with the squint." The street was quiet, and Squint Eye was in close attendance on the wise strangers, and Joseph and Mary and the child slipped away on the road to the south. Later that day, the learned strangers also rode away, but not northwards towards the city, the direction from which they had come. Rather, they traveled directly east towards the great salt sea. "Odd," said Uncle. "Surely they cannot expect to be taken in by the Essenes. They would not welcome Gentiles. But perhaps they hope to travel by Jericho." Squint Eye watched the travelers as far as eye could see. He turned to Uncle and said, "Your guests are leaving you, but perhaps they hope to travel. Your guests are leaving you. Perhaps it's the quality of the wine." "You do not seem troubled by the quality," replied Uncle. Squint Eye sneered. "Speaking of travelers, where is that Joseph fellow?" But Uncle only shrugged in reply and continued to rotate his barrels of new wine. That night, Squint Eye too left the village. He journeyed north towards the city. "Good riddance," said Uncle to his departing figure as it crested the hill to the north. It was 2 days later that the soldiers came. Like the locusts of the old stories, they descended on the village. With their captain rode Squint Eye, but locusts would have been less cruel. Every baby boy in the village slaughtered. They seized Simon's small brother from his mother's arms. She turned to Squint Eye, calling for mercy, but with a practiced stroke, a soldier murdered the child as coolly as a priest offering sacrifice in the temple. Simon's mother flew at the soldier's arms upraised, but he turned and with equal lack of emotion struck her down. "Run, boy," shouted Uncle, and grappled with the blood-stained soldier. Squint Eye plunged his dagger into Uncle's back. Uncle dropped to the ground, coughing blood. "That's for the bad wine, old man," he sneered. Simon had turned to run, but Squint Eye was as quick as he was cruel. "Get that boy," he shouted, and a guard grasped Simon by the edge of the tunic and hauled him back. The captain of the troop looked down at Simon. "This one's well over 2, he said to Squint Eye. "Only the boys under 2. Those were the orders." "Growing merciful in your old age," sneered Squint Eye. "They won't like that in the city. Besides, I need information from that shaver. Boy," he hissed to Simon with a smile as cruel as sudden death, "show me where that Galilean and his brat are staying, and you'll live." "But they're gone, sir," screamed Simon. The smile disappeared. "If you're lying, boy, you'll live long enough to regret it, but not much longer." "It's true. I'll show you where they lived, and you can judge for yourself." Squint Eye shook Simon by the hair and cuffed him on the ear. "No tricks now. Take me there." Simon led the small party of soldiers through the alleys to Joseph's house. As he had said, the cottage was abandoned. Squint Eye bent down to the hearth and felt among the ashes. "Cold," he squawked. "Maybe the boy's telling the truth. Keep searching." He shouted to the soldiers, "I want that Galilean brat." He turned back to Simon. "So they left, did they? Back to Galilee, I warrant. Well, that'll do them little good. Boy, which way did your friends go?" Not my friends, sir, and I don't know which way they went." But very carefully, Simon let his eyes slip slightly towards the north. That's how it is it?" Squint Eye laughed sneeringly. "Don't try to match wits with your better, boy. You've told me all I need. He cuffed Simon again, knocking him spinning against the doorpost. Now get back to the inn where you belong. There's going to be an opening for an innkeeper in this village, I fancy. And remember, I know where to find you. Simon stumbled back through the alleys to the ruins of the inn. His uncle, supported by a weeping neighbor, was still breathing, though his shallow gasps told even Simon that death was very near. Bend down your ear, Simon, he wheezed. I'll pass soon. Must tell you. Coins behind the second last large wine cask. Take them and flee. They'll return for you. Don't lose a moment. Nothing for you here, now. You'll never be safe here. Remember my friend Reuben? Sea captain. He'll care for you, for my sake. Uncle tried to raise his right hand. The blessing of the God of Era. But he never did complete the blessing. Simon retrieved his old dark cloak, stooped to pick up a loaf still warm from his mother's oven, and bent to grope behind the second wine cask. He felt a small but heavy bag and fetched it out with the aid of a kitchen spoon. He counted out 10 coins from the sack to the neighbor and said, Take this, good friend, and see that my kin are properly buried, I pray you. I must obey my uncle's last command. By nightfall, Simon too had left Bethlehem, traversing by starlight the hill paths westward to the great sea. He reached the port of Caesarea Maritima in 3 days. By the mercy of God, Reuben's ship was moored a stone's throw offshore. Simon, who could not swim, hired a small craft to row him to the ship. Reuben recognized the exhausted lad from a distance, aided him to scramble up the merchant's vessel's inward sloping hull, and took him below to the great cabin where all the crew slept. When Simon recounted the events in Bethlehem, Reuben wailed and tore his garments. He bent over the cook's hearth, grasped a handful of ashes, and poured it over his head. Come with me. Be my cabin boy and also my son, he cried out. So Simon, the innkeeper's nephew, became a sailor. This is the end of part 1 of our story.